Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about coaching and mental health, and we're going to be doing that with Josh Frost. Josh, welcome.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me. Really excited to talk about elite coach mental health today and have a really good kind of discussion around some of the research in this area.
Great to have you on, Josh. You're an Englishman in Australia, aren't you?
Very much am. I have, been here for around 5 years now, and can actually call myself an Australian, believe it or not. So when it comes down to the Ashes, it can be a bit of a hot topic. Although I am English through and through, so you have to.
So when it comes down to the Ashes, are you supporting England?
Yes,
or,
yeah.
or you
Don't you worry.
right?
But some of my Australian friends will be telling me otherwise. That now that I have a citizenship here, that I should be kind of going towards their side a little bit more. But English through and through.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a PhD research student at the University of Melbourne. My research is also affiliated with an organisation called Origin, which is a youth mental health centre in Melbourne, and I'm positioned within the elite sports and mental health team there. So we conduct a lot of research with athletes, coaches, high performance sports support staff to kind of find ways to better support our elite sports people in that kind of area in space. So yeah, I've been doing that for over 2.5 years now, and getting into the final year of my research and PhD, which is really exciting.
You mentioned there that you're based at the University of Melbourne, but also associated with an institute called Origin. Can you tell us a little bit about Origin?
Yeah, absolutely. Origin, like I said, is a kind of a national youth mental health centre. It's been going around for a number of years and works with a lot of different organisations, ranging from whether it be elite sports, whether it be individuals working with mood disorders or affective disorders and stuff like that. And they also do clinical practices as well. So it's a whole range of supports and services that can be utilised to better support the mental health of individuals, particularly those of young people, so between the ages of 16 to 25. So the premise, or one of the kind of leading philosophies of the organisation, is trying to find ways to intervene early to support people who are presenting symptoms of mental health, and to find ways to kind of support them. So yeah, in the context of the elite sports mental health team, we do that with a range of athletes. And in my case, looking at coaches and finding ways to intervene early and prevent symptoms of mental ill health to support those sorts of individuals.
You're currently doing a PhD in mental health and elite sport. Why this area, Josh? What's grabbed your attention about mental health and elite sport?
Yeah, good question, Dan. I think, from my experience a few years ago, I was working for a elite sports organization to assess the mental health of elite coaches, and we were kind of doing psychometric assessments and evaluations of coaches. And we currently had some kind of measures and instruments that we could do to assess coaches, but I was kind of interested that athletes had a lot more considerable momentum around their kind of research and finding ways to support them and evaluate their kind of mental health symptoms compared to coaches. And I was always, after doing a bit more research in that area, I was a bit intrigued to find out ways that we could actually, look after our coaches or support them, because, well, from my point of view, elite sports coaching at that time is quite a tricky and quite a challenging profession to be in. So I was always curious about, why do we not have as much attention or empirical attention upon upon coaches compared to their athletes. So that was kind of a little bit of my interest and stuff like that, in working in the kind of industry a little bit, and trying to find trying to find gaps within the literature and research about why this community perhaps haven't had as much attention, given that, they should also be considered performers in their own right. Coaches are people that, have confidence levels and different types of motivation, and mental health might impact those sorts of ways, and it might have a subsequent influence upon performance and results related outcomes. So yeah, I was just very interested about that and wanted to know a little bit more about why there was such a paucity of research in this field.
That's really interesting. I mean, borrowing from your experiences here, speaking with coaches and observing coaches,
Mm.
and I don't know if you've coached yourself, but I love that idea of coach as performer. So when you think about that with relation to your work or your observations or your experiences, can you just broaden that a little bit more for us? You mentioned confidence, for example. Absolutely. What else does it make you think of?
Yeah, I think it's important to, not when we look at like performance outcomes of a sporting team or of an athlete and
Hmm.
stuff like that, it's really important to not think that the coach is obviously independent of that. They have the opportunities to make tactical decisions. They have opportunities to contribute towards the athlete is playing or the team, for example. So, thinking of things that might shape their ability to make those decisions. What type of leadership styles do they have, for example? What is their type of communication in terms of verbal and non-verbal? How does that subsequently impact or influence the athlete or team, for example? So they have an ability to shape and impact the way an athlete or team performs. And in that respect, I think it should be taken into consideration that they are performers in their own right.
Three things I wrote down there as you were speaking. They shape behaviors every single day. Communication, decision making factors, not just around team makeup, but also around, as you say, tactical application, technical evaluation. Um, it's just in many respects, coaching is a decision making process, isn't it? But I just wanted to dwell on that for a couple of minutes because I think that's such an important um, way to view coaching, that it is a performance and you are a performer. And when you're out there, so often I have conversations with coaches, Josh, around doing the things that are going to help you as a coach to high perform within your training environments. And that means you do have to draw back to your state of your well-being, your mental health, because if you're experiencing ill mental health, if you're experiencing ill being, if those are the right terms to use, it becomes very difficult to be performative on the pitch. It becomes very difficult to be an effective high performer. No question, just a reflection back at you there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something to definitely take into consideration. One's mental health and psychological well-being should be taken to aspects of performance, and I think that's one of the crucial things that are starting to develop over the last 5 years, or however we consider it to be. That when we're looking at performance, we're not just looking at the technical expertise or even just the psychological components of working through plays or opportunities in a game or whatever, for example, but actually also focusing upon your well-being. How does your mood, how does your mental health, how does stress impact the way that you're actually kind of performing? And I think that's something that has obviously been taken into account into athletes, but also needs to be considered when we're looking at coaches and how they kind of perform and operate within that space. So I think it's a really important thing to kind of touch on in that aspect.
Well, we're here today to unpack a passion project of yours. I'm guessing it was. It's a systematic review. Perhaps you can remind us all what a systematic review is. I think probably the name speaks for itself, but it would be great to get some more details from you. It's entitled The Mental Health of Elite Level Coaches, a systematic scoping review. You were the main author here. You had a number of colleagues who helped you, not least Dr. Courtney Walton and Professor Rosemary Purcell, who have been on the podcast before. And if anybody is interested in listening to that, it was episode 190 on the Sports Psych Show. Be a wonderful listen alongside this episode as well. Other colleagues that you had co-author this paper: Krista Fisher, Kate Gwyther, Michael Koczyginski, and Simon Rice. So, Josh, to start us off here, take us through the process of what a systematic review is, and the process of engaging in a systematic scoping review. And perhaps it would be great to start by telling us a little bit about the objectives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, for a scoping review, basically the idea, or a systematic review, is to kind of synthesize all the evidence that is available out there to find out what we know is within the kind of knowledge base. What are the gaps within the research? What needs to be focused kind of going forward and stuff like that? what do we know about a specific objective or a specific topic on hand. So there's been a few kind of reviews out there looking at coaches and high performance coaches, but they've tended to focus on burnout, well-being, stresses, for example. And I was very curious, wanted to know about mental health specifically for elite level coaches. So that was kind of the underlying premise of the research project or the systematic review, to understand what do we actually know about the mental health of elite coaches. So we had kind of three overarching, I suppose, research questions. One, looking at what do we know about the mental health of elite level coaches. We then looked at what are the risk and protective factors that contribute and shape towards the mental health outcomes of elite level coaches. And then what is the relationship between mental health and coaching effectiveness? So something that we talked about a little bit there in the context that, elite coaches are performers in their own space and their own right. How might their mental health subsequently have an influence upon their ability to perhaps function or perform or be effective within their kind of role and things like that? So yeah, those are the three kind of overarching research questions. The first question that we looked at was obviously what we know about the mental health of elite level coaches. And for that, we utilized a dual continuum model of mental health, which has kind of been put forward and proposed by Corey Keyes. So that's the kind of theoretical framework that we utilized to be able to contextualize the findings. So to give a little bit of background behind that, for those who don't know what the kind of dual continuum model of mental health is, the basic premise is that mental health can be kind of evaluated or identified as a complete state of mental health predicated upon two different kind of continua or two distinct kind of phenomena. So when we're looking at one continua, one phenomena, we're looking at something called mental well-being, and this can, often be something that changes throughout our day-to-day lives. How does our mood change, for example? How does our quality of life impact? What do our social supports and societal functioning kind of look like? So it's something that we all experience, and it's kind of it's a spectrum that might go up and down. When we're looking specifically at kind of traditions or philosophies that underpin what mental well-being is, we're looking at often hedonic and eudaimonic traditions. So, hedonic traditions is more like the experience of pleasure and the experience of, good moods and positive affective states or negative affective states, or whatever it might be. Whereas we're looking at eudaimonic traditions, or we're looking at those sorts of aspects of mental well-being. We're looking at, what is one's purpose within one's life. How does your functioning kind of look like? So to try, kind of sum it all up, when we're looking at kind of mental well-being, we're looking at, kind of those aspects of pleasure in one context, or mood, for example, those more fluctuating states. And then we're also looking at kind of, people's experience within life, ability to function, ability to pursue life goals, those sorts of aspects. So those kind of both traditions comprise of the vertical continua of the mental health model. And then on the kind of horizontal continua, we're looking at the presence and absence of symptoms of mental ill health. So in this context, we're looking at, has an individual, are they presenting symptoms of a mood disorder or an affective disorder, or do they have no symptoms of that? And when we comprise, or when we combine our, where you might be on the spectrum of mental well-being and the spectrum of mental ill health, we then get our kind of evaluation of an individual's full experience of mental ill health and whether they're flourishing or languishing, perhaps. So, that's a little bit of an overview of the mental health model, and we utilize that framework to then inspect and evaluate what we know about the mental health of elite coaches from within the discourse.
That sounds like a pretty robust model. I know back in episode 190, spoke at length to Courtney Walton and Rosemary Purcell about this model. Quite robust. So you're distinguishing, or Corey Keyes is distinguishing, between well-being and ill mental health. And is the suggestion here that a coach can coach effectively, even if they're experiencing ill mental health?
Yeah, the model postulates, or it puts forward that you can be experiencing mental ill health but you can have kind of high levels of mental well-being in the context that you could be performing very effectively within your kind of role or functioning. You may be experiencing symptoms of depression, for example, but you might still be able to perform effectively within your role or get the best out of your athletes, for example. So I think it's really important to, outline that people who are experiencing poor mental health or challenging kind of symptoms of mental ill health, that they are still able to be kept within their role and are able to perform in the best way possible. There's lots of examples of athletes, for example. Someone like Michael Phelps is someone who's perhaps experienced depression or has been diagnosed with that, but being able to flourish within their role of competing and getting lots of Olympic gold medals and whatnot. So although we're looking at the relationship between coaching effectiveness and mental health and trying to, understand, given that this obviously, there's just really not a lot of evidence at the moment to support this relationship robustly. It's important to be cognizant that we don't want to ostracize people in the elite sports environment who might have been diagnosed with a disorder or experiencing poor mental health, because they might still be able to perform at the highest level. So that's where the framework becomes really useful, to be able to contextualize where someone might be sitting within that framework and how that kind of impacts their performance outcomes.
So as you're unpacking these research papers, you're doing so through the lens of Corey Keyes' model. As you're looking at risk and protective factors, is another model at play that you're utilizing to unpack these papers?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dan. We utilized Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory to essentially identify all the different contributing factors that might influence an elite coach's mental health. So when looking at this model, we can take, a systems theory model, we take the individual level or the individual level factors that might shape an individual's mental health. So those could be things such as, personality, maybe genetics, maybe other sorts of factors, demographics, coaching age, background, education, those sorts of experiences. Then we look at kind of a sphere of influence or a layer on top of the individual level. We can look at what I've contextualized as the interpersonal level. So how do your family, friends, how do the relationships that you have with individuals contribute towards your overall mental health? Then we look at a layer further, we can look at the perhaps organizational level. So I'm talking about all of these, I suppose, in the context of an elite sports environment. The model is obviously more generalizable to normal communities and whatnot. But when we're looking at the organizational level, we can look at things like how does workload, for example, how does your organization support the way you experience mental health? What are the sort of resources that you have available? What does your job security look like? How much do you travel? Those sorts of things can be important when considering the organizational influence. And then looking at the final kind of sphere of influence, the macro system, we can look at more societal influences. So these might be things such as, perceptions of help seeking or stigma towards help seeking from society. Do people consider a coach someone who could be able to go get mental health help support given the role that they're within? Other sorts of things might be sporting cultures, for example. So, often in team environments, you get very hyper-masculine cultures, and this can contribute poorly towards mental health outcomes. And then you can have other things such as media scrutiny, for example. How does that influence a coach's mental health in that aspect? So this is a really great model, and it's been utilized a lot across the research over the past few years and stuff like that to kind of help identify and examine all the factors that might shape mental health outcomes in elite sports.
A final area of interest you had with this systematic review was coach effectiveness, the relationship between mental health and coach effectiveness. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Why the interest here?
Yeah, I think coaches tend to be, or high performance coaches tend to be individuals who are trying to get the, I suppose, advantage in any way that they can, or trying to find ways to optimize performance or functioning within their athletes and stuff like that. And as I kind of spoken about a little bit earlier, mental health is something that's important in this area to be able to find, if someone's mental health is poor, although, as I've kind of talked about, it's not going to be the exclusive factor that contributes towards performance outcomes, but it might be something that can contribute towards those aspects. So it was something that we were looking at to see if there is a relationship or a link between mental health and coaching effectiveness, given that this might be something that can be used to leverage broader buy-in for coaches. If a coach perhaps feels like this is something that can enhance their performance or can get the best out of the athletes, and this needs to be taken into consideration, then it's something that's going to be beneficial not only for themselves if they're taking into account their own mental health, but also their athletes, and contributing towards more psychologically safe environments and behaviors that hopefully optimize the mental health of the athletes or sports team along with themselves. So yeah, it was something that we were, like I said, looking at, and found some kind of preliminary evidence and research in that space. Like I said, there wasn't real kind of robust kind of evaluations or measures between coaching effectiveness and mental health, but there were kind of some more like anecdotal and like comments that were made through qualitative investigations about how an individual's mental health, whether they're experiencing burnout or symptoms of depression, how that might influence their kind of ability to coach effectively, whether that be themselves, so things such as I talked about, focus, decision making, ability to regulate emotions, or even things such as how their athletes function as well. So how does body language, for example, influence their ability to communicate across their messages, or how athletes receive or interpret that information? How does that influence, athletes' standard of performance in training, for example, if an individual or a coach is experiencing burnout, for example? So there was a few interesting points that were kind of came out from the review in that context, but there needs to be a whole lot more of further research to be able to investigate this relationship in more detail.
I'd love to unpack some results. So begin at the beginning for us here. Take us through a few of the findings.
Absolutely, Dan. I think the first kind of major finding was more kind of research based in terms of what has been previously unpacked within the discourse and literature. And we found that research predominantly focused on kind of themes associated with burnout and mental well-being, as opposed to the presence or symptoms of mental disorders in elite level coaches. So there was a real kind of paucity of evidence kind of unpacking what we know about depressive symptoms or symptoms of anxiety or adverse alcohol use in elite coaches. So there needs to be a lot more further research in that kind of space, so we can actually fully comprehend and understand the extent to which coaches experience mental health and the complete state that they might be experiencing these states. So that was one of the important things that we kind of found. But through that, we were looking and kind of evaluating or examining the quality of the methodologies that we utilized. And we found that tended to be quite poor, and that there weren't kind of lots of robust research being utilized. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed kind of going forward, with more validated and more robust sorts of psychometric measures to be able to understand specifically and reliably be able to evaluate symptoms of mental ill health in elite coaches. So that was a big component to be considered. Like I said, there were also a range of different kind of risk and protective factors. So we found ones that were spoken about quite a lot were things such as effective psychological skills or ineffective psychological skills. So things such as resilience and hardiness were contributing factors towards kind of good mental health, whereas something like low emotional intelligence was something that might shape poorer mental health in elite level coaches at the individual level. One of the big kind of components that was kind of popping up a lot was social support and the real influence of how coaches within your network, how family members, how perhaps friends can really be a buffer against poor mental health and really support you through challenging times. It's because, as you probably heard from anecdotal experiences through the news and stuff like that, lots of coaches talk about how the profession can be often quite lonely and isolating. So ensuring that you have strong social networks and that organizations are making sure that coaches have time to connect with family and connect with friends is really important, so that they can optimize their mental health and hopefully support their overall performance outcomes. So there was a really interesting range of factors that were kind of identified that you can probably look at throughout the paper. One of the things that we unfortunately weren't able to do was to kind of evaluate which factors are most influential in contributing towards mental health outcomes in elite level coaches. So that's something that I'm going to be doing a little bit, hopefully down the line in my research, being able to pinpoint and identify which factors actually have more or have considerable influence on coaches, because we just identified the range of factors that were out there.
As you were speaking there, it was making me think of the importance of coaches having skills and competencies, or developing skills and competencies in order to self-manage, combined with finding social support, perhaps deliberately, perhaps intentionally, finding social support in order to help them manage through, as you mentioned, the perceived loneliness of the profession, or the hobby that they're engaging in. That was what I was thinking as you were speaking there.
Yeah, I think it's important to consider both, the individual and their kind of responsibility and role to perhaps upskill individually in some of their skills to be able to protect and manage their own mental health, but also the influence of perhaps the organization in providing educational interventions or skills. Or one of the things that we've been looking at as a kind of point of early intervention and prevention is the exploration of mental health literacy in elite level coaches. So how does a coach's kind of mental health literacy influence their ability to detect symptoms of mental health in their athletes or themselves and things like that? So having organizations or federations or sporting bodies being able to put educational programs in place to upskill individuals is, I think, just as important as the individual going out to seek social support for themselves, for example, or trying to enhance their emotional intelligence or resilience or whatever it might be from an individual psychological characteristic. So yeah, there's a bit of ownership and responsibility on both the individual and I think the organization at this stage.
I think that's really interesting because it's making me think of the importance of an organization developing from top down, from the macro structure downwards, um, a psychologically informed environment. One that, because I think, and maybe this is just me, who tends to think about a psychologically informed environment, from a microsystemic perspective or a mesosystemic perspective. So really, at the level of the individual, or the team of players. But as you're speaking there, if one thinks of the responsibility of the organization to put in place the kind of things, the psychologically informed environment that is going to benefit, that the coach is going to benefit from. They're going to care about their coach. They're going to give that coach the necessary support, and the potential education pathway that enables the coach to maintain, experience a sense of well-being. That's absolutely vital. And when we come back to coach effectiveness, this is potentially where a sporting organization, when they put these kind of things in place, or at least consider these things and start to put these things in place, that can have a positive knock-on effect to outcomes, because the organization, especially at the professional level, the elite level, these organizations in many respects exist to win, right? And so if we want to win, then the mental health of our coaches, our coaching staff, matter. And so if we can put the right macro structural processes in place, we have a psychologically informed environment. That gives a coach a better chance to thrive and flourish in that environment. Again, Josh, I don't think I've formulated the question. It's just you've got my brain buzzing with thoughts here.
I think it's really important. There's two things to consider there. I think from the first point of view, I think it's important actually just for organisations, although it would be important, perhaps having these kind of educational programs or systems to be able to support coaches and stuff like that for performance related outcomes. But I think it's also important from a duty of care perspective. These are individuals or management and board people, or people working within the board or whatever it might be. They might have expectations of how a coach is meant to, or what they're meant to achieve. I think it's really important, firstly, to kind of consider them as people. Like athletes are susceptible to kind of mental health, we need to ensure that coaches are kind of not perceived as commodities. So that's one aspect, but definitely, having interventions or having structures or having training programs to be able to support coaches to inform their kind of psychological literacy or mental health literacy, it can have a significant impact upon how the way that they treat their athletes and how that subsequently impacts the way their relationship between the athlete might be, and then various kind of performance related outcomes that emerge due to that. I think there's a really important kind of aspect to consider there between that relationship of finding ways to support coaches and providing them the kind of information that's needed.
There's two things I'm thinking here. I'm thinking of the coaches supporting themselves and organizations supporting coaches. That two-pronged approach feels powerful. And perhaps if I think about the sporting landscape right now, we're not doing this well enough yet. I suppose hence why we're having this conversation and hence why you're doing this work. And perhaps, if right now this is very, very topical. Jurgen Klopp in the Premier League, and we've spoken to this a few times on the Sports Site show recently, Jurgen Klopp is stepping away from his position as head coach or manager of Liverpool in the English Premier League because he feels he doesn't have the energy to carry on. Another example right now in the world of football, soccer, is Javi Hernandez, who's stepping away because, in his words, doesn't feel he's getting the support of the organisation. I'm sure neither of us can comment on that in a deep way because we're not within that organisation, but that's what he's on record as saying. So I think this is really, really interesting. So, perhaps if we can have a brief conversation now about what coaches can do to help themselves and specific things that organizations can do from top down, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. I think there's so many factors or things that I suppose both coaches can do and also that organizations can do to allow coaches to be able to support their own mental health and well-being. Um, Obviously, coaches tend to be individuals who can often have very short amounts of time to be able to take away from the sport and be within a 24/7 working role. So it can often be hard to implement some of these kind of supports or activities and things like that. But we found from within the kind of preliminary research that obviously things such as exercise and trying to maintain or put that within one's schedule can be really important to preventing kind of symptoms of burnout. Organizations trying to find way to allow coaches to implement this within their schedule or regime can be really beneficial. There's also a little bit of research around coaching identities and having identities outside of being a coach oneself can be a really strong protective factor in supporting one's mental health. So if a coach perhaps feels that their profession or their role has a strong influence upon their sense of character or identity, if a coach is experiencing frequently poor performances or poor results and stuff like that, that might have a subsequent influence upon their own mental health outcomes and stuff like that. So ensuring that coaches have the time to be a dad or be a mother or be, a friend or something like that can be really valuable in just distancing oneself from the profession and providing a bit of a space and buffer. We've talked about before the things such as having a support network and making sure that you have a robust set of social supports around you, making sure that you're connecting with friends and families despite having kind of time limitations in there involved as well. Are you connecting with potentially other coaches and feel comfortable in discussing some of those things associated with mental health? Do you feel like you could be vulnerable in that space as well? So when I speak to coaches and they discuss their social supports and stuff like that, it's often one of the most significant or considerable factors that might kind of support their overall mental health. So ensuring that as much as possible, you're trying to have people around you that can support you through your career or profession can be something that's really influential. And then finally, when I'm thinking of perhaps more psychological characteristics or coping mechanisms or skills that can be utilized to support one's mental health, we're finding actually there's been a little bit of research around mindfulness and self-reflection to find ways to be actual to support one's mental health. So we've found also there's some of the research out there that mindfulness can decrease levels of anxiety or cultivate greater emotional stability in high performance coaches. So looking at ways to tap into mindfulness or mindful self-reflection to cultivate self-awareness or self-compassion are really important aspects and factors that can actually be beneficial to one's psychological well-being. So there's a few kind of individual factors that coaches might consider and think about when they're listening. Do I have some of those aspects in my life? Do I have a support network that's beneficial to me and my overall well-being? what do my identities kind of look like? Do I affiliate very strongly as being a coach? And do I have time to be able to perhaps step away from the profession at opportunities? Now, obviously, that's not always an easy case given the demands of being a high performance coach, but ensuring that you have an awareness of that can be really important. And that's where the organizations can come in and be able to support a coach to allow them to flourish and having an external identity aside of coaching, having the time to connect with family and friends. Those things can be really important to protect one's hopeful mental health. And we hope from that aspect, it can then contribute towards better performance outcomes rather than burning coaches out, rather than allowing them to deal with tremendous amounts of stress and job insecurity or whatever that might be. So organizations have a really important opportunity to create those structures so coaches can have the agency to be able to support their overall mental health and well-being.
I love everything you said, and as you're speaking there, I'd love to share with you some of my own thoughts and get your response. My own thoughts from the coalface, because I hear everything you say and I 100% agree with you, and it's really insightful, and I'm writing these down now. But I want to share a few ideas with you as well, and perhaps actually take a bit more of a helicopter viewpoint as well here. That I think sometimes coaching comes burdened by a definition of, as coach, I have to be all-knowing and all-seeing. You use the term identity there. As a coach, I have to be all-seeing, all-knowing. And I find this especially at the very highest level of sports, the adult elite level, the professional level, if you like. Coach as hero. Coach has all the knowledge. Coach is all-seeing and therefore has to live up to that identity. And I think that prevents sometimes coaches becoming great collaborators and delegators within an organization across their staff, if they're lucky enough to have multiple staff, which at the professional level, more and more now that is the case. They feel they have to be the key decision maker, whereas I wonder if we need to continue to chip away. And I suppose I'm going off piece, but staying on the same mountain here, because I'm thinking about the mental health, the well-being of the coach being maintained through a different definition of being a coach or a head coach, that I can delegate, and I have to be comfortable with that. And when I delegate, I take workload away from me. I can collaborate, not just with my fellow coaches, but across the staff at my organization. I can collaborate maybe with my players, maybe the senior players. I've sometimes been into organizations and thought, wow, that head coach is working endless hours here, trying to find solutions themselves, when maybe slightly more collaboration and delegation might take some workload off, but also provide more creative solutions here. And maybe I'm coming off the mountain here. Maybe I'm going into a different area here, and I don't want to, but I think delegation and collaboration are really important, not just for the efficacy of your coaching, but also for your mental health as a coach. I'm going to pause there because I've got a couple of other things I want to throw at you, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point you pick up on there, Dan, in terms of the responsibility and roles of a coach, and how having this expectation that they're meant to be a role model or meant to be the individual responsible for all the decision-making processes can have a real influence upon their workload and overall psychological well-being. I think from when I look at the kind of research, and one of the points made in the paper is that we found controlling leadership styles tend to be more associated with things such as burnout. So more passive and less controlling leadership styles can operate as more of a kind of protective factor. So, having that kind of all-encompassing responsibility that everything is kind of on your shoulders can be something that can be very overbearing for coaches. And that's where organizations, whether they can come in and devolve responsibility for individuals and, give less responsibility upon the head coach and, devolve it to assistant coaches and stuff like that, might be something that's beneficial to kind of manage workload and put less pressure on coaches in their kind of environment and role. So yeah, it's a really important thing to kind of touch upon in terms of their roles and responsibilities and how that might contribute towards their mental health and performance outcomes.
But I just think it's a fascinating link. And I think, as you're speaking there, it's making me think of, for example, I'll take English football, English soccer as an example here, and Brighton and Hove Albion in the English Premier League. And obviously, they've gone from the lower divisions right up to the Premier League, and a part of their progress has been as a consequence of the incredible organizational structure they've created behind the scenes. I think it's 5, 6, or 7 different departments that, okay, one could suggest that that puts more pressure on a head coach to be able to lead across those departments, granted. But if the organization, as you're pointing to there, actually helps the head coach understand the importance of utilizing the staff across those departments, they've got experts within those departments who can pick up on so much of the work that really a head coach might feel is their responsibility, then that can reduce pressure, it can reduce anxiety, it can reduce workload, and reduce the possibility of burnout, as you're mentioning there. So I think delegation and collaboration is vital for a coach, and they can engage in that themselves. But as you're mentioning, the organisation can create an environment, a culture, if you like, through their structure, through their process, to encourage a coach to delegate and to collaborate.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of the idea of, I suppose, division of labor and optimizing efficacy and stuff like that. If you're devolving the responsibility to people who are best in class in that job and stuff like that, that might be something that kind of helps people progress or advance within their sporting competitions. I think back to 20 years ago, whenever in the Premier League, when the manager had all the kind of responsibility and they were in charge of scouting or the performances and tactics, and they had so much influence and responsibility, and how that's kind of changed over time. It'd be interesting to see how that kind of may have influenced kind of mental health outcomes, having that complete autonomy and control over every kind of department of a sporting organization, how that might differ from now, when maybe a coach in the Premier League or in another sport might only be responsible for the technical and tactical expertise that kind of function in sport. It would be a really interesting kind of comparison between how stress or mental health might kind of change between those two generations.
One other word that came to mind as you were speaking, and please excuse me if you covered this to a degree, but it would be good to briefly go back over it, is motivation, and the potential for coaches to have a more sophisticated relationship with motivation, in as much as, and again, we're speaking very much about elite sport here, the adult professional game. It essentially exists for outcomes. We could put it that way. And that very much directs motivation extrinsically. I wonder if it's helping coaches to deepen and broaden their motivational, to deepen their motivation and broaden their desires. By that I mean, can they have more intrinsic markers? Can they hold the position whereby they know that they need to obtain certain objectives, and there's a great degree of extrinsic motivation there to do so, but they also have the capacity to consider their position from an intrinsic perspective, the enjoyment that they derive, the continued enjoyment they derive from coaching, from the game that they're coaching, from being with the people who play the game that they coach and they love the game that they coach. Surely intrinsic motivation is a big part of coaches managing their mental health.
Yeah, very much so. We found from within the review that coaches who had higher levels of intrinsic motivation had kind of protective factors against mental health, whereas coaches who might be more extrinsically motivated might be more susceptible to poor mental well-being or mental health. So, it's always natural in high performance sport and environments that you are going to get a high degree of, extrinsic kind of influence and objectives and things like that, and pressure, for example. But trying to maintain that reason of why you're coaching, what got you there kind of in the first place, why do you enjoy, how does the relationship that you have with athletes, how does that support your well-being and your kind of connection to the profession and role? Those sorts of things can be really influential, not only for one's mental health, but also your sustainability within the profession, and continuing to go and continuing to want to be involved in this career path and things like that, I think can be a really important kind of aspect. So yeah, both things that you got to try, I suppose, try find a balance. There's always going to be extrinsic pressures, but ensuring that you have connection to why you're performing or operating within the space is really important for coaches.
Absolutely fascinating. And I also think of the day-to-day environment for a coach and the functioning of an organization. It makes me think, hey, look, also collaboration, delegation, a sophisticated relationship with motivation, and then those essentially self-organization skills. What do I know? Do I know enough? Am I intrapersonally good enough? Am I able to manage upwards? All of those things I think are thrown into the cocktail. But that's my worldview. You mentioned that there are future projects on the go at the moment, and the landscape, the research landscape, is quite fertile. So what's happening right now in your world in terms of other research projects, and what are you looking towards in the future?
We've got a number of different research projects currently underway for my PhD. They're largely based around a few months ago, or last year, sorry, rather, we released a paper about early intervention to support the mental health of elite level coaches. We put together a few kind of ideas that we thought, based on elite athletes and other kind of empirical evidence, ways that we can support elite coaches. But at this moment in time, we don't really have enough research in that specific high performance community to be able to build frameworks or interventions that support coaches. So we've got 3 different research projects underway. One is looking at mental health literacy in elite level coaches. So we're trying to understand how coaches are they able to identify symptoms of potentially depression or burnout, for example, or other disorders. Are they able to what sorts of help seeking pathways would they utilize or employ to be able to support their mental health, or in athletes, for example? So we're looking at one research project trying to explore mental health literacy and try to understand how we can tailor specific educational systems to be able to support the unique stresses and distinct challenges that coaches face in the context of mental health literacy. We've got a second kind of research project. Oh, I should mention, sorry, that research project is through kind of an online survey. So we're doing that with international participants, so high performance coaches from all around the world, to really gather kind of, I suppose, broad insights to see how coaches' similarities might kind of overlap between different natures and what might be some of the differences that emerge. We've then got another research project looking at kind of risk and protective factors in elite coaches. So trying to evaluate and understand through interviews or semi-structured interviews, how coaches, what are their kind of experiences of mental health, and what are the contributing factors shaping those specific experiences. So it gives coaches a real voice and an opportunity to tell some of their experiences of the coaching environment, how organizations, how social supports, how individual specific factors might contribute towards their mental health and well-being. And then within also that research project, we're also asking coaches, a little bit about the relationship between mental health and coaching effectiveness, and what are their perceptions of what mental health might look like in their kind of mind, and how it might influence their ability to function. So yeah, that research project's currently underway at the moment. And then the final research project is a mental health help-seeking project looking specifically at Olympic level coaches. So we've got something called an online concept mapping methodology that we're going to be utilizing to identify pathways to best support coaches. So what are the factors that might be contributing, as in kind of barriers or facilitators, towards mental health help seeking coaches. So it's really important to get tailored and evidence-based support services and pathways to make sure that coaches feel comfortable in accessing services. And we're trying to find factors that might be contributing as barriers or facilitators, so that we can create those kind of tailored referral pathways to support our coaches if they need the support necessarily. So yeah, some really interesting projects that are premised around kind of early intervention principles, coming back to kind of the idea of origin and what that kind of represents. Coaches, as all people, are going to be susceptible to challenging times with their mental health, and ensuring that we have structures to support or intervene early before the onset of a mental health disorder or a mental health crisis is really important. And that's where we're kind of looking at to develop that empirical evidence to be able to provide structures to be able to support coaches.
Well, this is great and really important work, Josh. Absolutely fantastic, fascinating, and absolutely vital, as I say, and so pertinent. It's always been pertinent, but obviously now we live in an age where so much more of this stuff is being normalised, and so the conversations are becoming, going to use that word again, more sophisticated. So this is absolutely fantastic. Josh, I know that you would have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So how can people find you, follow you, find that paper that we've been speaking about today, and get in touch if that's possible for them to do so?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think the best way is on Twitter. You can follow me at Josh Frost 77. I have the kind of paper pin there on top of my kind of profile at the moment. So you can access that as it's open access. So it's all free to anyone to be able to have a read of that. So if you're interested in finding a little bit more about what we know about the mental health of elite level coaches, that's the best way to have a look. You can also, if you look at the kind of thread that specific post, if you're interested in being involved in any of the research projects, kind of click on some of the links under the threads and you can be involved in contributing towards the surveys and being involved in some really important research. Otherwise, if you want to kind of contact me via email or have opinions or thoughts about kind of elite coach mental health or research or whatever it might be, you can contact me at josh.frost@origin. That's orygen.org.au. And you can ask any questions you have from either this podcast or from any of my research projects available. It'd be great to hear from any of you out there.
Josh, thank you so much for today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's been a real pleasure talking about this and definitely always gets me thinking about how we can help coaches in better ways, given your thoughts, experiences and insights in the high performance environment too.
Well, everybody, I've really enjoyed that podcast and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.